In the stillness of Blackwood Manor, something was waiting, something that had been hidden for generations. A figure, cloaked in shadows, had haunted the halls, its presence felt in the cold air, in the dreams of the young girl who lived there. But when the doors creaked open one fateful night, what they uncovered was more terrifying than any ghost. If you're intrigued by the mystery of Blackwood Manor, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. You won't want to miss the chilling truth we're about to reveal, so stay with us until the very end. Chapter 1. The Whispering Wind. The night had settled over the quiet countryside like a heavy velvet cloak, its deep blackness only broken by the occasional shimmer of distant stars. As the carriage rattled along the worn cobblestone path, the trees seemed to stretch their gnarled fingers toward the heavens, their silhouettes dark and twisted against the pale moonlight. It was a strange, almost foreboding sight, an ancient road leading to an ancient manor known as Blackwood Manor, isolated at the far edge of a forest that had long been untouched by human hands. Sherlock Holmes sat with his back straight, his sharp eyes scanning the misty landscape outside the window with quiet intensity. Beside him, Dr. John Watson sat in his usual, more relaxed manner, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the carriage's lantern. He was no stranger to their many adventures together, but this was different. Blackwood Manor was not just any case. It was one that sent shivers down his spine. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice breaking the silence. "Are you certain of this? There have been no reports of actual criminal activity here, only rumors of a ghost?" Holmes's piercing gaze shifted from the window to Watson, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "Rumors, Watson, are often the most telling pieces of information. They reflect the truth in a distorted form. People here have spoken of a phantom haunting Blackwood Manor, but I believe there is more to this than mere superstition." Watson furrowed his brow, looking toward the looming silhouette of the manor as the carriage drew closer. The wind had begun to pick up, howling through the trees as if carrying the voices of long-dead souls. The manor itself was a majestic structure. Its tall, looming towers seemed to pierce the sky, and the windows, dark and empty, gave it an air of desolation. They had arrived. The carriage came to a slow, creaking halt in front of the heavy oak doors of Blackwood Manor. The air was thick with an unsettling quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of the trees and the soft footfalls of the coachman as he approached the door. Holmes, ever composed, stood first, his tall figure cutting through the mist with ease. Watson followed, his heart quickening as they made their way to the entrance. The moment Holmes stepped inside, the air seemed to change. The vast hall before them was bathed in an eerie stillness, and the faint scent of aged wood and dust permeated the air. The stone floors, worn from centuries of use, seemed to groan beneath their feet. Despite the beauty of the manor, its high, ornate ceilings and intricate tapestries, it felt as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something, or someone, to make their move. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." A voice interrupted their exploration, and they turned to find a man standing at the far end of the hall. He was tall, with graying hair and a serious expression, his eyes shadowed by the dim light. He introduced himself as Thomas Barlow, the manor's steward. "Forgive the somber reception," Barlow said, his voice soft and hesitant. "I've never been one to believe in such things, but the happenings here, they have escalated, and it is beyond my understanding. Holmes stepped forward, his presence commanding but calm. "Tell me more, Mr. Barlow. I believe the answers to this mystery lie within the manor itself." Barlow nodded grimly. "It is not the manor that troubles me, sir, but what is inside it. Strange noises at night, the sounds of footsteps echoing down the hall, although no one is there, and sometimes, a shadowy figure appears at the top of the staircase, as if watching me." A deep silence fell over the room as Barlow's words hung in the air. Watson could feel the chill in his bones, as if the shadows themselves were creeping closer. But Holmes, ever the skeptic, seemed undisturbed by the steward's story. "Footsteps?" Holmes mused, his voice thoughtful. "And a shadowy figure, you say? I suspect, Mr. Barlow, that what you are describing is not a ghost, but something far more earthly." Barlow's face paled slightly. "You think there is a human behind this?" "Perhaps," Holmes replied cryptically, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the grand staircase that spiraled upward, disappearing into darkness. "But we shall see." Without another word, Holmes moved toward the staircase, his footsteps deliberate and measured. Watson followed, his mind racing, unsure of what they would find. The atmosphere in the manor seemed to grow heavier with every step they took, as if the house itself was breathing in the shadows. The further they ascended, the colder it became. The once welcoming warmth of the lower floor now felt distant, swallowed by the chill of the upper chambers. Holmes paused at the top of the stairs, his sharp eyes scanning the hallway before them. There were no sounds now, only the heavy silence that seemed to pervade everything. "This is where the apparition is said to appear," Barlow explained, his voice trembling slightly. "At the far end of the corridor, near the library, you can see it. Or rather, you see the outline of it. A dark figure, cloaked, standing there, watching." Holmes walked to the end of the corridor, his eyes never leaving the shadows that lined the walls. He paused and turned to Watson, his gaze steady. "No figure, no ghost, but something hides here." Watson, although a man of reason, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. His eyes darted toward the shadows, where the darkness seemed to fold into itself like a living thing, waiting. But then, there it was. A faint sound, barely audible, but unmistakable. The softest echo of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone, or something, was following them from behind. Watson's heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, but the hallway behind them remained empty. Holmes, however, was not startled. He stood still, his face composed, studying the space with an intensity that made Watson feel both reassured and unnerved. "There is no ghost here, Watson. What we are dealing with is a mystery that will be solved through observation, not fear." The wind outside howled louder, as if urging them to uncover the truth hidden in the darkness of Blackwood Manor. And as they moved forward, each step filled with anticipation, the mystery deepened, the shadows grew longer, and the silence became more oppressive. What was it that haunted these halls? Was it a phantom of the past, or something far more sinister? The game, as always, had begun. Chapter 2. The Ghostly Footsteps. The following morning, Blackwood Manor was as silent as a forgotten dream. The once towering trees outside stood motionless against a backdrop of pale mist, their branches curling in twisted forms, as though they too were trying to escape the grip of time. Inside, the mansion was shrouded in a stillness that felt almost sacred, as though it were holding its breath, awaiting something. The clocks ticked in unison, but there was no movement, no life, only a heavy, oppressive quiet that hung in the air. Sherlock Holmes, ever the observer, sat by the grand fireplace in the parlor, his long fingers tapping absent-mindedly on the armrest of his chair. The crackling of the fire filled the room with a warmth that seemed to defy the coldness that had settled into the house's bones overnight. Beside him, Dr. Watson sat with a contemplative look on his face, his eyes fixed on the embers that glowed red and orange in the hearth. Holmes had been unusually quiet since the previous night's events. The faint footsteps, the inexplicable feeling of being watched. He could sense the layers of mystery that shrouded Blackwood Manor, but the key was still elusive. He could feel it, the way the house seemed to hum with a kind of energy, a presence that only he could perceive. Holmes. Watson finally broke the silence, his voice low and careful, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the fragile calm around them. Last night, I heard the footsteps, just like Barlow described, but when we investigated, there was nothing. Could it have been the wind, or perhaps the house settling? Holmes shifted his gaze from the fire, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were peering into the very fabric of the mystery itself. Wind, Watson? He mused softly. Perhaps, but there is something far too deliberate about these sounds. The footsteps are not random. They have purpose, and they are not the sounds of a house settling. They are the sounds of someone moving deliberately through the halls. Watson furrowed his brow. But who would be here at this hour? The manor is practically deserted except for Barlow and the housekeeper. Holmes nodded, his mind already whirring with possibilities. Exactly. And that is why we must not rely on the simple explanation, Watson. There is something, or someone, lurking in the shadows of Blackwood Manor. Our task is to uncover the truth behind these ghostly footsteps. As Holmes spoke, a soft sound broke the quiet of the room, a sound so faint it was almost imperceptible. A gentle tap, then another. The sound of footsteps, slow and measured, echoing from the hallway beyond. Watson's heart skipped a beat. This time, the sound was undeniable. It was not the wind, nor the house settling. These were footsteps, real, living footsteps, moving as though they were taking their time, drawn to something, or someone. Holmes's eyes flashed with understanding. There it is again, Watson. The footsteps. They are deliberate, purposeful, as I suspected. The two men stood in unison, the crackling of the fire, the only sound as they moved quietly through the parlor. Holmes's sharp gaze never wavered as he led the way down the narrow corridor that stretched before them. The footsteps grew louder, more distinct as they approached the source. It was almost as if the house itself were guiding them, urging them toward the heart of its mystery. As they reached the top of the stairs, the sound paused, and then nothing. Holmes did not falter. His movements were as fluid as water, his mind sharp as a blade. He turned to Watson, who stood beside him, his face pale with anticipation. The silence in the air was thick now, almost suffocating. "Watch closely, Watson," Holmes murmured. "The answer lies in the details." They descended the staircase slowly, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hallway below. The manor seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, its dark corners and winding passageways swallowing them whole. The further they moved, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The temperature dropped ever so slightly, a coolness that crawled beneath their skin and made the hairs on the back of Watson's neck rise. It was then that the sound returned, a soft creak of a floorboard, the unmistakable sound of steps moving cautiously in the direction of the library. "That's where Barlow said it appears," Watson whispered, his voice barely audible in the thick silence. Holmes did not respond, but his eyes flickered toward the doorway of the library. He moved forward with calculated precision, his mind working faster than his feet could carry him. The footsteps, now clear and unmistakable, were drawing nearer. They were soft, but heavy with purpose, as though the person responsible for them knew exactly where they were going. As Holmes stepped closer to the door of the library, a shadow flickered across the far wall. A movement so subtle, so fleeting, it might have been missed by anyone less observant than Holmes. His sharp eyes caught it in an instant. "Did you see that, Watson?" Holmes asked softly, his voice a quiet whisper. Watson nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and intrigue. "A shadow. But where did it go?" Holmes stepped forward, his movement steady and deliberate. The door to the library creaked open under his hand, the sound cutting through the air like a knife. Inside, the library was dark, its shelves lined with old, dust-covered books. The faint smell of aged paper lingered in the air. But the room was empty. Or was it? Holmes's eyes moved quickly across the room, his gaze narrowing as he spotted something unusual. A faint, almost imperceptible trail of dust on the floor, disturbed in a straight line that led to an old, forgotten door at the far end of the room. The door, barely noticeable behind a row of shelves, appeared to have been opened recently. "Ah," Holmes murmured, his lips curling, into a knowing smile. "We have found it, Watson. The path that leads to the heart of the mystery." The sound of footsteps continued, but this time they were fading, moving away, as if the figure they had been following had vanished into the very walls of the manor. Watson's voice trembled. "Holmes, what is it? Who was it? Where did they go?" Holmes paused for a moment, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "The phantom, Watson, is no ghost. It is a person. A figure hidden in plain sight, moving through the shadows, leaving behind only the faintest trace." The door creaked open with a soft groan as Holmes pushed it slowly. The room beyond was even darker than the library, its walls lined with old furniture draped in sheets of dust. A single dim light filtered through the cracks in the window shutters, casting a faint, eerie glow across the room. And there, standing in the corner, was a figure, cloaked in shadows, its face hidden. Holmes moved closer, his eyes focused on the figure, but the moment he stepped forward, the figure vanished. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, "we are not dealing with a mere ghost. This is something far more intricate. Someone is hiding here, someone with a motive, and they are playing their part in a dangerous game." The footsteps had stopped, the figure had vanished, but the mystery had only deepened. As Holmes turned to Watson, the chill in the air seemed to grow, and the shadows around them began to stretch longer, reaching out into the dark corners of the manor. The game, indeed, had only just begun. The mystery of Blackwood Manor was far from over. Chapter 3. The Strange Apparition. The day had passed in a quiet, almost unnatural rhythm. The sun had slipped behind a blanket of gray clouds, and the manor was bathed in an odd, dusky light. It was the sort of day that seemed to stretch endlessly, where time felt like it was slipping away unnoticed, and every tick of the clock brought them closer to something unknown. Blackwood Manor, once majestic in its splendor, now seemed like a sleeping beast, its vast halls shrouded in mystery, its walls whispering secrets they were not yet ready to reveal. Holmes had been particularly quiet since their exploration the night before. His usual sharp gaze, usually filled with a glimmer of untold knowledge, was now focused inward. He spent hours combing through the manor's old records, looking for something, anything, that might explain the phantom-like occurrences. Yet, with each page turned, the more questions arose, and the deeper the mystery grew. Dr. Watson, though unsettled, tried to maintain his composure. The strange events weighed heavily on him, as they did on the steward, Thomas Barlow, who had been unusually nervous throughout the day. He had spent the entire afternoon muttering to himself, and when he was not in the parlor or the kitchen, he was nowhere to be found, as if hiding from something unseen. But it was that evening, as the last light of day slipped away, and the manor embraced the twilight, that the tension in the air became palpable. The house seemed to sigh as the wind howled through the cracks of the old windows, pushing against the cold stone with an eerie persistence. And then, just as the clock struck the hour of 8, a soft knock came at the door. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." It was Barlow, his face pale, his hands trembling ever so slightly. "I believe you need to see this." Without a word, Holmes stood and followed the steward through the grand hall, Watson at his heels. The silence of the house seemed almost suffocating now, every footstep echoing louder than it should. As they moved deeper into the manor, the walls seemed to close in on them, the shadows gathering in every corner, watching, waiting. Barlow led them upstairs, his steps quickening as they approached the room at the end of the corridor, the room where the apparition had been seen. As they neared, Holmes's eyes narrowed, the sharpness of his intellect slicing through the thick fog of uncertainty that clouded the manor. I heard it again," Barlow murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's back." They stopped at the door of the room. Holmes did not hesitate. With a single, deliberate motion, he pushed the door open, his sharp gaze immediately scanning the room. The room was large, with heavy curtains drawn over the windows, blocking out the night. The furniture was covered in dust, its outlines barely visible in the dim light that filtered through the cracks. "Where?" Watson asked, his voice steady, though a knot of tension had begun to form in his chest. Barlow pointed to the far corner of the room, his hand shaking slightly. There. It was standing right there. Holmes's eyes flickered over to the corner, where shadows seemed to twist and form a darker, more impenetrable mass than the rest of the room. His gaze swept over the furniture, the floorboards, and the walls, but there was no sign of the figure. Only silence. "Do not fear, Barlow," Holmes said in his calm, reassuring tone. "There is no ghost here, but there is something else, something hidden." Holmes moved forward, his footsteps silent on the worn wooden floor. He walked slowly, methodically, toward the corner where the apparition had been seen. Watson followed, his heart hammering in his chest. He could feel the chill in the room now, a coldness that seemed to seep into his very bones. As Holmes reached the corner, he paused, his eyes scanning every inch of the space. And then, in the dim light, Holmes noticed something so subtle, it might have been missed by anyone else. a faint outline on the floor, a disruption in the dust that had settled over the years. It was a footprint, small, yet clear. "Ah," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible. "There it is." Watson leaned in, trying to make sense of it. A footprint? But what does it mean? Holmes crouched down, his long fingers brushing over the floorboard as he examined the footprint. It was not the mark of a man or even a woman, but something altogether different. It was too shallow, too faint, as though it had been made by someone or something, wearing soft slippers, moving quietly through the room without leaving a trace. The hairs on the back of Watson's neck stood on end. But who would have made this, and why? Holmes stood slowly, his gaze lingering on the footprint for a moment longer before his sharp eyes turned toward the door. He was thinking, calculating, putting the pieces of the puzzle together with a precision that only he could achieve. "This footprint, Watson," Holmes began, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it now, a sense of urgency. "It's not a human footprint. It's a mark made by someone who has mastered the art of silence, someone who knows this house well, someone who is hiding in plain sight." Barlow's breath caught in his throat. But the figure, the apparition, what does it mean? Holmes turned to him, his gaze unwavering. "The figure you have seen, Barlow, is not a ghost. It is someone, or something, using this house as its cover, moving in and out without leaving a trace. The so-called apparition is simply a distraction, a clever ruse to keep the truth hidden." The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of Holmes's words hanging in the air like a storm on the horizon. Watson looked from Holmes to Barlow, his mind racing, trying to piece together the events of the past few days. "Then, why?" Watson asked softly. "Why would anyone want to make people believe in a ghost?" Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was no humor in it. "That, Watson, is the question we must answer, and I believe it will lead us to the heart of this mystery." With that, Holmes turned toward the door, his movements fluid and purposeful. He paused just before stepping into the hallway and looked back at Watson and Barlow. "I suggest we continue our search, gentlemen. There are more secrets to uncover in Blackwood Manor." As they left the room, the sound of their footsteps echoed in the emptiness. But for Watson, the silence felt different now. It was as though the house itself had begun to whisper once more, and the shadows that had been hiding in plain sight were waiting for them to discover the truth. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, but the manor remained still, its secrets buried beneath layers of dust and forgotten memories, waiting to be uncovered. And somewhere in its depths, the figure, the phantom, was waiting too, biding its time, ready to reveal its part in the story of Blackwood Manor. The game had become more dangerous, and Holmes knew that the key to solving it lay not in what was seen, but in what was hidden. And it was only a matter of time before they would uncover the truth. Chapter 4. The Child's Dream. The stillness of Blackwood Manor was becoming unbearable. After days of subtle discoveries, the tension in the house had reached a fever pitch. Every creaking floorboard, every gust of wind felt charged with unspoken secrets. Holmes had been methodically investigating the manor, but it was becoming apparent that no amount of logic or reason could untangle the web that surrounded it. The manor, once a place of noble grandeur, now felt like a labyrinth of uncertainty, its dark corners and forgotten rooms whispering untold stories. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes and Watson found themselves in the parlor again, the fire burning softly in the hearth. The soft crackling was the only sound that could be heard for miles as the house settled into its unshakable silence. Holmes had been lost in thought for hours, his fingers gently tapping on his chin as he worked through the fragments of the mystery in his mind. Watson, though not quite as immersed, could sense that the end of this particular case was near, but the solution still eluded them. Something about this case felt different. It was not just a haunting, it was a puzzle. Then, as if summoned by the stillness, a soft knock echoed through the door. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Ethelstone, her face as pale as the fog that had settled outside. She seemed hesitant, even frightened, her hands wringing the edges of her apron. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling. "It is Miss Clara. She has been having nightmares, terrible dreams, over and over again." Holmes turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Nightmares, you say? What kind of dreams?" "She speaks of a shadowy figure," Mrs. Ethelstone continued, her voice lowering to a whisper. "One that follows her through a darkened hall, always watching her. It stands in the corner of her room, its eyes glowing, and it whispers her name." Holmes stood and motioned for Watson to follow him. "Lead us to her, Mrs. Ethelstone." The housekeeper led them down a long, narrow corridor, past a row of empty, darkened rooms. The air seemed heavier here, laden with a quiet sense of foreboding, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the echoes of countless forgotten moments. As they approached Miss Clara's room, Holmes paused for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings with the precision of a hawk. There was something about the manor's architecture, the way the shadows played with the light. It all seemed too deliberate, too orchestrated. It was as if the house itself was a puzzle that only the right mind could solve. The door creaked open, revealing Miss Clara's room. The girl was lying in her bed, her face drawn and pale, as if the nightmares had drained the very life from her. She looked up at them, her wide, frightened eyes filled with a fear that could not be quelled by simple words. Holmes approached her slowly, his steps light, almost cautious. "Miss Clara, may I speak with you?" She nodded hesitantly, sitting up in her bed, her hands clutching the blanket as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. I don't want to sleep anymore, Mr. Holmes. The figure, it's always there, in my dreams, watching, waiting. I try to run, but my legs, they won't move." Holmes sat down beside her, his gaze soft but intent. "Tell me about this figure, Clara. What does it look like?" She shivered as she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It's tall, cloaked in black, and its face, it's not a face at all, just shadows, like the darkness itself." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, his mind already racing. "And you see this figure in your dreams, you say?" "Yes," she whispered, her eyes distant as she relived the nightmare. "It follows me through a hallway, and when I reach the end, I can never escape. It always catches me, and then I wake up, but I can still feel it. It's like the dream never ends." Watson looked at Holmes, concern evident in his eyes. "This sounds like more than a mere nightmare, Holmes. What do you think?" Holmes's eyes never left Clara's face, his expression calm but piercing. "There is something here, Watson. Something in this house. Something that has found its way into Miss Clara's dreams. But the question is, why her? Why this particular child?" Holmes turned back to Clara, his voice gentle yet firm. "Miss Clara, I need you to tell me one more thing. When you wake from these dreams, where do you wake up? In your bed or somewhere else? Clara looked confused for a moment, as if the answer had never occurred to her. I wake up in my bed, of course. But sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm not sure where I am. The room looks different. The shadows seem closer. Holmes's mind was already at work, piecing the fragments together. The dream is not just a dream, Clara. It is a memory of something you have experienced in this house, something buried deep within you. Watson looked at Holmes, his brow furrowed. But how is that possible? Miss Clara has lived here all her life. Surely she would remember something like that. Holmes stood and turned to Mrs. Ethelstone. Has Miss Clara ever mentioned seeing anything strange in the house? Any shadows that didn't belong? Any corners where she felt uneasy? The housekeeper hesitated, her eyes flickering with unease. There are places. In the West Wing. Sometimes Miss Clara speaks of the library. She says she hears whispers there, but when she goes to investigate, there's nothing. Holmes turned back to Clara, his gaze piercing. Clara, I believe your nightmares are connected to something in this house, something you've seen before, but cannot fully remember. I need you to be brave. Tonight, when you sleep, try to remember what you see in the shadows. Focus on it. It may hold the key to unlocking this mystery. Clara nodded slowly, her face pale with fear. But there was a spark of determination in her eyes. I will try, Mr. Holmes, but I'm scared. Holmes smiled faintly, his voice soothing. Fear is natural, but remember, Clara, it is only through the darkness that we find the light. Trust in yourself, and in the truth we seek. With that, Holmes and Watson left the room, closing the door behind them. The quiet of the manor seemed to wrap around them like a thick fog. As they walked down the hall, Watson's voice broke the silence. Holmes, what do you think is happening here? What is it that Miss Clara is seeing? Holmes's gaze was distant, his mind working at a pace that Watson could hardly follow. There are forces at play here, Watson. Forces that have been dormant for many years. But I believe we are close. Very close. They walked in silence, the weight of the mystery hanging heavy between them. The shadows of Blackwood Manor stretched long, and the air seemed to grow colder. There was a truth hidden here, buried beneath layers of time and fear, and it was waiting to be uncovered. The game was afoot once again, and as the clock ticked into the night, Holmes knew that the answers were closer than ever. Chapter 5. The Hidden Passage. The air in Blackwood Manor had become dense with anticipation. It hung like a fog, quiet but omnipresent, filling the spaces between every whisper and creak of the house. Holmes had grown more silent as the days passed, retreating deeper into the maze of his thoughts. Every clue they unearthed seemed to lead to more questions. The house, it seemed, was full of secrets. Secrets that were carefully hidden, waiting for the right eyes to find them. That afternoon, the manor was once again shrouded in the stillness of the past. The wind had died down, and the sky above was a muted gray, as if even nature had chosen to hold its breath in reverence to the mystery unfolding within the walls of Blackwood Manor. Holmes sat alone in the study, his fingers lightly tracing the spine of an old, dusty book, though his mind was far from the pages. Watson, on the other hand, paced restlessly in the adjacent room, his concern growing with each passing hour. Holmes, Watson finally asked, breaking the silence. "What are we missing? There's something more to this manor, isn't there?" Holmes, without looking up, smiled faintly. "Yes, Watson. The key to the mystery lies in what is hidden. We have been searching the obvious, but the true answers are always concealed in the shadows, far from plain sight." As if to punctuate his words, a sudden soft knock interrupted them. It was Mrs. Ethelstone again, her face drawn with worry. She looked almost relieved to find Holmes, as though she had been waiting for someone to unburden her. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, her hands wringing the edges of her apron. "There's something strange I've noticed, something I didn't want to mention before, but I feel I must now." Holmes raised an eyebrow, motioning for her to speak. "What is it, Mrs. Ethelstone?" The housekeeper glanced over her shoulder as if ensuring no one was listening. "There's a part of the manor hidden away. It's not on any of the blueprints. I found it by accident some years ago when I was cleaning the old library. I never dared to tell anyone before. It frightened me." Watson stepped forward, his curiosity piqued. "A hidden part of the manor? How could something like that be kept secret?" Mrs. Ethelstone shook her head. "It's not a room, Mr. Watson. It's a passage. It starts behind one of the bookcases in the library. A narrow corridor, one that seems to go deep into the bowels of the house. I've heard strange sounds coming from that direction at night, and sometimes I see a shadow moving in the corner of my eye." Holmes, who had been listening intently, stood suddenly, his mind racing. "This is it, Watson. The passage. It's been right under our noses the whole time." The housekeeper led them once again to the library, the heavy silence of the hallway swallowing them as they walked. The library, normally filled with the musty smell of aged paper and leather, now felt colder, more oppressive. Mrs. Ethelstone paused at a large wooden bookcase that lined the far wall, its shelves sagging under the weight of countless old books. I never could find the mechanism to open it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's there. Behind this shelf, I swear it." Holmes, with a focused determination, moved toward the bookcase, his fingers tracing the edges of the thick wood. He examined every detail, from the grain of the wood to the dust that had settled on the shelves. As his fingers brushed against a row of leather-bound books, something shifted. A faint clicking sound echoed in the stillness. Watson watched, both intrigued and slightly uneasy, as Holmes gently pulled one of the books forward. The entire bookcase shifted with an almost imperceptible motion. A hidden passageway, narrow and dark, lay before them. It was the kind of passage that seemed to have been forgotten by time itself, left behind in the shadowed corners of history. "Well," Holmes said, his voice low but filled with satisfaction. "What do you think, Watson? Shall we see where it leads?" Watson nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his cane. Though the passage was shrouded in darkness, there was an unmistakable pull to it, an invitation, as though it had been waiting for them to discover its secrets. Holmes took the first step, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness ahead. Watson followed, his heart quickening with each step. The passage was cramped, the air damp and cold. The walls were lined with old stone, and the floor beneath them creaked with every footfall. The further they moved into the depths of the house, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and the walls seemed to close in around them, as if trying to keep them from moving forward. Holmes's eyes darted from side to side as he moved, his mind working furiously. It is clear, Watson, that this passage was meant to be hidden, not just from visitors, but from those who lived here as well. It's a secret kept for a reason. Watson's voice echoed slightly in the narrow space. But what could it be for, Holmes? Why hide it away? Holmes paused, his sharp gaze scanning the darkness ahead. I suspect, Watson, that this passage holds the answers we seek. The truth of Blackwood Manor has been concealed for too long. Whatever happened here, whatever is still happening, this is where it all began. The passage began to twist and turn, its path growing more erratic. The walls were lined with cobwebs, as if no one had dared enter this forgotten part of the house in generations. And then, as they rounded a final corner, the passage opened into a small chamber, one that had been untouched by time. In the center of the room, a strange sight met their eyes. A large wooden chest sat against the far wall, its surface worn and scratched by the years. The chest, however, was not what caught Holmes's attention. It was what lay beside it, a series of strange symbols etched into the stone floor, forming a circle. "This," Holmes murmured, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "This is no ordinary chamber. This is where the key to the manor's mystery lies." As Watson stepped closer, he felt a sudden chill run through him, as if the room itself were holding its breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of uncovering something far darker than they had anticipated. Something ancient, something that had been hidden for a reason. Holmes, ever the detective, kneeled before the chest, his fingers brushing against the rough wood. "What are we dealing with here, Watson? A secret kept from the world? Perhaps a family's buried sins? Or something else entirely?" The mystery was deepening, and as Holmes turned the key in the lock, the lid creaked open, revealing whatever dark truth lay inside. The game was nearing its final act. The chamber in the heart of Blackwood Manor had given them a glimpse of the past, and it would lead them to a revelation that none of them were prepared for. The truth of Blackwood Manor was about to be revealed, but would it be more than Holmes, or any of them, could handle? Chapter 6. The Unseen Hand. The atmosphere in Blackwood Manor had shifted. What had begun as a mystery of whispers and shadows had now escalated into something far more tangible. An enigma wrapped in a history of secrets, sorrow, and unseen forces. Holmes, though composed as ever, had a furrowed brow. The passage they had uncovered led to no immediate answers, but it had pointed them down a darker, more intricate path. As they returned from their exploration, the weight of the unknown hung heavier than ever. The manor itself seemed to breathe with them, its ancient walls groaning under the weight of untold stories. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, sending eerie echoes through the empty halls. Inside, the house remained still, as if waiting, watching. The heavy air pressed in on them, making every step, every breath feel deliberate. Holmes sat in the study, his eyes narrowed, the faint light of the flickering candle casting shadows across his face. Watson sat nearby, his mind racing with questions. After days of searching for answers, they had found the hidden passage, but the deeper they ventured into the manor's secrets, the more elusive the truth became. "I've been thinking," Watson began, breaking the silence. "What if the figure we've been chasing, the one haunting Miss Clara's dreams, is more than just a phantom? What if it is something, someone, alive in this house, manipulating the very air around us. Holmes looked up at his companion, his gaze sharp and calculating. "I believe, Watson, you are closer to the truth than you realize. There is someone, or something, moving within the walls of Blackwood Manor, and I am certain it has been orchestrating events from the shadows, unseen by our eyes, but always present." Holmes stood, walking toward the window, where the night had begun to settle into the manor. The full moon bathed the landscape in an eerie, silvery light, casting long, stretched shadows across the ground. "I suspect, Watson, that what we are dealing with is not the work of a mere ghost or figment of the imagination. It is far more sinister." Watson stood as well, his hand instinctively resting on his cane, as though seeking comfort in its solid form. But why? Why torment Miss Clara? Why hide in the shadows? Holmes turned back to face Watson, his expression grim. The answer lies in the past of this manor. It is not only the house that holds secrets, but those who lived here. The sins of the past have a way of echoing through time, Watson. And what we are witnessing now is the result of something long buried, perhaps even something forgotten. Before Watson could respond, there came another knock on the door. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried an urgency that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Ethelstone entered, her face pale, her expression strained. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice tight with fear. "There is something you must see. It's Miss Clara." Holmes immediately rose from his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on the housekeeper. "What is it, Mrs. Ethelstone? What has happened?" The housekeeper's hands were trembling as she clasped them together. "Miss Clara, she's gone. She left her room in the middle of the night. No one saw her leave, but I found her standing at the top of the staircase this morning, eyes wide open, as if in a trance." Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, both men instantly on alert. "Lead us to her, Mrs. Ethelstone," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm. The housekeeper nodded, her face filled with fear and confusion as she led them up the stairs. As they ascended, the manor seemed to grow colder, the silence oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, reverberating through the narrow corridors. They arrived at Miss Clara's room to find the door ajar. Inside, the room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly, and the air heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. But what struck Holmes and Watson most was the sight of Clara herself, standing at the far corner of the room, staring into the wall as if in a trance. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, yet there was a strange calm about her, a stillness that seemed entirely unnatural. "Clara?" Mrs. Ethelstone whispered, stepping forward. "Miss Clara, can you hear me?" But Clara didn't respond. She remained frozen, her gaze locked on the wall. Holmes, ever methodical, stepped closer, his sharp eyes scanning her for any sign of recognition. He reached out gently, placing his hand on her shoulder. "Miss Clara, what are you looking at?" he asked softly. At the sound of his voice, Clara's body stiffened. Her eyes fluttered, as though she were waking from a deep sleep. Slowly, she turned to face Holmes, her expression vacant, but filled with a kind of detached sorrow. "I saw it," she murmured, her voice distant. "The figure. It's in the wall. I saw it looking back at me. It wanted me to follow it." Holmes's mind immediately began to race, his thoughts connecting the dots faster than his feet could follow. "The wall? Clara? Where exactly did you see it?" Clara's eyes, though still distant, shifted toward the far side of the room. She pointed to a spot where the wallpaper had begun to peel away, revealing the faint outline of something beneath the surface, something that didn't belong. Holmes moved toward the wall with purpose. Watson followed, his brow furrowed in confusion, unsure of what to expect. Holmes pressed his hand gently against the wall, his fingers tracing the outline of the hidden shape. It was faint, barely visible under the layers of paint and dust, but it was there. A series of intricate markings, almost like a symbol, embedded within the structure itself. "There's something behind this wall," Holmes murmured, his eyes never leaving the markings. "A secret, but not just any secret, a message." Watson stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on the wall beside Holmes. "What does it mean, Holmes? Could it be connected to the figure Clara saw, the same one haunting her dreams?" Holmes nodded slowly, his mind whirling. "I believe so. This symbol, it's old, perhaps as old as the manor itself. It's not just a mark, it's a warning." Without hesitation, Holmes began searching the room for anything that might help uncover the hidden truth. He noticed that one of the floorboards near the wall had been disturbed, slightly lifted as if someone had tried to pry it open. Holmes knelt, his fingers working quickly, and within moments he had pried the board free. A small, dust-covered box lay beneath, its metal edges rusted from years of disuse. Holmes's eyes glittered with satisfaction as he lifted it carefully. "This, Watson, is the key. We've found the source of the mystery." He opened the box, revealing a stack of old letters, yellowed with age. The letters were carefully tied with a string, each one marked with the same strange symbol that had appeared on the wall. Holmes held the letters in his hands, his expression unreadable. "The answers are within these letters, Watson, and with them, the final pieces of the puzzle." As Holmes began to unfold the first letter, the room grew still once again. The house seemed to exhale, its walls creaking as if a great weight had been lifted. But the danger was far from over. The letters were more than just words. They were a message from the past, a revelation that would uncover the truth about Blackwood Manor, its haunted history, and the unseen hand that had been pulling the strings all along. As Holmes began to read, Watson could feel the gravity of the moment settle over them. The mystery was close to being unraveled, but what they would discover next would shake the very foundations of the manor, and perhaps the truth itself. Chapter 7. The Truth Revealed. The night had deepened, and Blackwood Manor had grown eerily silent. Even the wind, which had earlier whispered through the trees like a distant conversation, seemed to have stilled, leaving the house wrapped in a heavy, expectant quiet. Inside the study, Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Ethelstone sat around the flickering light of a single candle. Holmes, with a steady hand, had begun to unravel the threads of the mystery that had entangled the manor for so long. The letters, carefully pulled from the hidden box, lay on the table before them. Each letter was carefully inscribed, its writing delicate but sharp, as though it carried with it the weight of years, of history long buried. Holmes had read the first one in silence, his brow furrowed as his eyes traced the inked words. Now, the room was thick with the anticipation of what these letters would reveal. "Mrs. Ethelstone," Holmes began, his voice low, yet unmistakably commanding. "These letters speak of something far darker than any of us could have anticipated. This house, Blackwood Manor, is not just a place of secrets. It is the place of a curse, a consequence of actions taken long ago. The housekeeper, her face pale with worry, leaned forward, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "What do you mean, Mr. Holmes? What do these letters say?" Holmes took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "They tell of a pact, Mrs. Ethelstone, a pact made in the shadows, in the deepest chambers of Blackwood Manor. A pact that has endured generations, passed down like a dark inheritance." Watson, his own heart racing with the tension of the moment, leaned closer. "A pact? But why? Why make such an agreement?" Holmes's eyes softened for a moment, but his voice remained steady, as though every word had been carefully measured. "This house has long been tied to a family secret, one that was buried beneath layers of time and deception. The Blackwood family, the original owners of this manor, made a pact with an entity, an ancient force that promised them power, wealth, and influence in exchange for a terrible price. The price, Watson, was the soul of one of their own." Mrs. Ethelstone gasped, her face pale, her breath catching in her throat. "The soul of one of their own? Who could have agreed to such a thing?" Holmes looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "It was Lord Alistair Blackwood, the patriarch of the family. He believed he was acting in the best interests of his lineage, seeking to protect the family from ruin. But the pact came at a cost far greater than he ever imagined. The entity they summoned, a force that no mortal should ever try to control, demanded that the eldest child of each generation be given over to its will, their fate sealed in blood." Mrs. Ethelstone stood abruptly, her face a mix of horror and disbelief. No, it can't be. That would mean—" "Yes," Holmes interjected, his voice calm, but filled with a certainty that made the room feel smaller, tighter. "The figure that Miss Clara has seen, the figure that has haunted the dreams of so many, it is not a ghost. It is the manifestation of the pact, a shadow, a guardian, created to ensure that the terms of the deal were upheld. And now, after all these years, the spirit, if we can call it that, has found a new victim, Miss Clara." The room seemed to close in on them as Holmes spoke, the truth unfolding with the weight of a heavy curtain being drawn away. It was as though the air had thickened, filled with the residual energy of a long-buried curse, clawing its way to the surface. "Miss Clara," Watson murmured, his voice a soft echo of disbelief. "But why her? She's so young, so innocent. Why now, after all this time?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered the question. The pact was never truly broken. Over the years, the Blackwood family, those who remained, tried to forget, tried to live in peace. But the entity never forgot, Watson. It was patient. It bided its time, waiting for the right moment to claim what was promised to it. And now, with the current generation of Blackwoods, the time has come. He paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. Mrs. Ethelstone remained, standing, her hands clasped tightly together, her knuckles white with strain. "But Miss Clara," Watson said, his voice trembling, "she is not. She is not part of this cursed bloodline, is she?" Holmes met Watson's gaze, his eyes glinting with a mixture of sadness and resolve. "No, Watson. Miss Clara is not the direct descendant of Lord Alistair Blackwood. She is his great-granddaughter, but she is still tied to the family's bloodline, tied to the pact, whether by lineage or by fate." Watson's heart sank as he processed the implications. So she is being haunted because of the sins of her ancestors? She is being punished for something she had no part in? Holmes nodded slowly, his expression softening. Yes, Watson. Miss Clara's dreams, the shadowy figure that has haunted her. It is a reminder of the pact, a way for the entity to reach out and claim what was promised. But there is still hope. Mrs. Ethelstone stepped forward, her voice trembling. Hope? How? What can we do to save her, Mr. Holmes? How can we break this curse? Holmes stood and walked toward the window, his gaze lost in the darkness outside, as though searching for the right answer in the night. We must destroy the source of the curse, Mrs. Ethelstone. The pact was sealed with a ritual, one that has left its mark on this house. The figure that haunts Miss Clara, the one she has seen in her dreams, is only the beginning. To end this, we must find the place where the ritual was performed and undo the magic that binds it to this house. He turned back to face her, his eyes filled with the determination that had guided him through countless mysteries. And that, I believe, lies in the depths of this manor. We must find the heart of the house, the place where the pact was sealed, and destroy it. The next few hours were spent in feverish preparation. Holmes, Watson, and Mrs. Ethelstone combed through the manor, retracing their steps through the hidden passages and forgotten rooms. The shadows seemed to grow longer as they delved deeper into the heart of Blackwood Manor, the house growing colder with each step they took. But Holmes was unwavering in his resolve. The pieces of the puzzle had finally clicked into place, and the time had come to confront the truth. At last, they arrived in the deepest chamber of the house, a room hidden beneath layers of time, locked away from the world. As they entered, the air felt charged, as if they were stepping into the very heart of the manor's darkness. The walls were lined with symbols, etched deep into the stone, a reminder of the ancient pact that had shaped everything that had happened within these walls. Holmes turned to Mrs. Ethelstone, his expression firm. This is where it began, and this is where it will end. He stepped forward, his hands moving quickly as he traced the symbols on the walls. We must break the seal, Watson. Only then can we free Miss Clara from the curse. With a final, deliberate motion, Holmes placed his hand on the center of the largest symbol, and the ground beneath them trembled. The walls groaned as if in protest, and for a brief moment, the house seemed to come alive with a soundless fury. But then, just as quickly, the room grew still. The curse had been broken. Outside, the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks of Blackwood Manor, bathing the house in the soft glow of morning. The darkness had been lifted, and with it, the centuries-old pact that had bound the family to the shadows. As Holmes stood in the now silent room, Watson's voice broke through the stillness. "Is it over, Holmes? Have we truly ended it?" Holmes smiled, though there was a tiredness in his eyes. "Yes, Watson, the curse has been lifted. Miss Clara is free." And with that, Blackwood Manor, once shrouded in mystery, fear, and darkness, was finally at peace. The truth had been revealed, and the shadows that had haunted it for so long had been dispelled, leaving only the quiet, soothing silence of a house that had been freed from its past. Chapter 8. A New Dawn. The first light of dawn crept over Blackwood Manor like a delicate brushstroke, painting the once shadowed walls with a warm, golden hue. The darkness of the night had finally receded, leaving behind a hushed tranquility, that seemed almost unnatural after the turmoil of the past few days. The wind that had howled through the trees was now a soft murmur, and the stillness in the air was as if the manor itself were exhaling a long-held breath. For Holmes, the weight of the mystery had lifted, though the satisfaction of resolution was tempered by a quiet exhaustion. He stood by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the grounds outside, but his mind was still turning over the events that had unfolded. Miss Clara, the last victim of the Blackwood family's dark legacy, was now free from the haunting presence that had tormented her. The curse, sealed by the pact made long ago, had been broken. And yet, even with the case concluded, Holmes knew there was still something profound in the air, something that could not be easily dismissed. Watson, ever by his side, was seated at the desk, his eyes lingering on the peaceful surroundings outside, though his mind was filled with the same quiet sense of wonder and disbelief. "Holmes," he finally spoke, his voice soft, as though not wanting to disturb the serene calm that had settled upon them. "Do you think Miss Clara will ever truly be free of this haunting? Or has something of the past still lingered within her?" Holmes turned to face Watson, his expression calm but thoughtful. "She is free, Watson. The shadow that haunted her was not a part of her soul, but a remnant of an ancient pact. It was not her fate that was cursed. It was the house, the family, and the legacy of those who had come before her. Now that the pact has been undone, she is free to live her life without fear. But you are right in one regard. What remains is the shadow of the past, a legacy that can never be erased completely." Watson nodded slowly, understanding the depth of Holmes's words. He knew that while the physical threat had been eliminated, the psychological scars would linger. Clara had seen horrors no one should ever have to witness, and though she might walk free, the trauma would likely stay with her. There was a soft knock at the door, and Mrs. Ethelstone entered. Her face was no longer clouded with fear or apprehension. In fact, there was a warmth to her features, a faint relief that had not been present when she first approached Holmes. She stepped into the room with a renewed sense of purpose, her posture straightening as she spoke. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I must thank you both, though words can never express how grateful I am for what you have done. Miss Clara, she is herself again. The nightmares have stopped. The figure has not returned. She is sleeping peacefully." Holmes gave a small nod, his gaze steady. "It was not just our doing, Mrs. Ethelstone. Miss Clara has strength in her own right, and the breaking of the curse was as much her victory as it was anyone else's." Watson added, "The manor itself seems to be at peace now. The house has finally released its grip on its past." Mrs. Ethelstone smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Indeed, but for how long, I wonder? What has been done? Can it truly be undone? This house has seen so much pain, so many secrets. How do we move on from that?" Holmes regarded the housekeeper with his usual calm demeanor. "The past, Mrs. Ethelstone, will always leave its mark. The house will remember, and so will the land upon which it stands. But the most important thing is this. Miss Clara can now live her life without fear. The shadow that has haunted her family for generations has finally been lifted. That is the first step toward healing." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Holmes's words settling around them like a blanket of stillness. The very air seemed to soften, as though acknowledging the weight of the journey they had all endured. Mrs. Ethelstone spoke again, her voice now softer, tinged with a sense of resolution. "What will happen to the manor now, Mr. Holmes? Will it remain like this, or should we leave?" Holmes turned to her, his eyes thoughtful. "The manor itself will endure, Mrs. Ethelstone, but I believe it can be rebuilt, in a way. Not just in terms of its physical structure, but in the memories and lives that will fill it moving forward. The curse is broken. The Blackwood family's legacy will no longer haunt these halls. It is up to the future to create a new story for this place." With that, Holmes stepped toward the door, his presence commanding but not oppressive. "I believe our work here is done, Watson. The manor will remain, but it will no longer be a prison to anyone. Miss Clara has the chance to live a life free from the shadows of the past." As they stepped out into the quiet morning light, the air felt fresh, crisp with the possibilities of what was to come. The manor behind them, once shrouded in darkness and fear, now seemed to glow in the gentle light of the new day. It was as though the house had exhaled, its secrets no longer held in the walls, and the rooms that had once felt cold and oppressive now seemed inviting, almost alive. Watson turned to Holmes, his expression filled with quiet admiration. "You've done it, Holmes. You've freed them all from the past." Holmes smiled, though it was a smile tinged with something far deeper than just satisfaction. It was a smile of understanding, a recognition that there are some mysteries that cannot be solved with mere logic, but must be unraveled with patience, persistence, and a deep understanding of the human heart. "Not all mysteries are solved with the mind, Watson," Holmes replied softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "Sometimes it takes understanding the emotions and fears that bind us. Only then can we truly begin to unravel the darkness." As they walked away from the manor, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees, a sense of peace settled over them. The storm had passed, the mystery had been solved, and Blackwood Manor, once a place of secrets and shadows, was now free to begin a new chapter. One where the past would no longer cast its long, oppressive shadow over the future. The game was over, but the dawn had only just begun. Chapter 9. A return to normalcy. Blackwood Manor, once a place haunted by the echoes of the past, stood now in the quiet embrace of a new dawn. The secrets that had festered within its walls, the curse that had clung to it like a shadow, had finally been broken. But as with all things of great mystery, the process of healing was not immediate. It was slow, deliberate, like the soft unraveling of a tightly wound thread. The morning after the curse had been lifted, the manor felt different. The cold, oppressive weight that had settled over it for so long was gone. The air, once thick with the scent of dust and decay, now seemed to breathe with a freshness, as though the house itself had taken in a deep, calming breath. The rooms that had once seemed dim and distant now stood vibrant in the early light, each corner and corridor infused with warmth and possibility. Holmes, as ever, was a creature of habit, moving through the manor's halls with quiet precision. He had never been one to linger too long on sentiment or the soft comforts that others might enjoy. For him, the satisfaction of solving a mystery was always short-lived, replaced by the compulsion to move on to the next case, the next puzzle. But there was something in the air this morning, something different. a quiet peace. Watson, ever the more sentimental of the two, found himself slowing as they walked through the now quiet hallways. There was an unfamiliar stillness in the air, one that almost invited reflection. He turned to Holmes, his voice soft, but carrying the weight of unspoken thoughts. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's truly over? For Clara? For the manor? Will they ever really escape the shadow of the past?" Holmes paused for a moment, his sharp gaze scanning the room around him. The fireplace had been lit, the scent of fresh pine filling the space. The once damp air now felt dry, with a hint of earthiness, like the beginning of spring. "It is over, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice steady but tinged with a rare softness. "The past can no longer reach out to claim Miss Clara, nor can it bind this house. The curse was not a force of nature, but a consequence of human actions. And now that the pact is undone, there is nothing left to tether them to it. The shadows of the past can only linger in memory, not in the present." Watson considered his words, feeling the truth of them, but also the weight of all that had happened. "But can the scars of the past ever truly fade, Holmes? Clara may be free from the figure, but will she ever forget what she saw? The torment?" Holmes turned his gaze to Watson, his eyes sharp but softened by an understanding that only years of friendship could cultivate. "No, Watson, she will not forget, nor should she. Some experiences shape us, whether we like it or not, but she can learn to live with them. The key to moving forward is not to forget, but to find peace in spite of the darkness. To heal, not by erasing the past, but by learning from it and choosing to step into the light." The sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation, and both men turned toward the doorway. It was Mrs. Ethelstone, her face bright with a quiet joy that had been absent during the earlier days of fear and uncertainty. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice gentle. "Miss Clara would like to see you. She feels she owes you both more than words can express." Holmes gave a small nod, his face betraying little of the emotion he might have felt at the housekeeper's words. "Lead the way, Mrs. Ethelstone." They made their way to Miss Clara's room, the halls now empty of the heavy atmosphere that had once clung to them. The house had shifted, as if it too were recovering from the long years of unease. Clara's door was slightly ajar, and as they entered, the room seemed bathed in sunlight, the warmth softening the sharp edges of the past. Clara was sitting by the window, her eyes gazing out at the rolling hills that surrounded the manor. She looked different, softer, more at peace than she had in the days before the curse had been lifted. The haunting pallor that had once clung to her face was now replaced by a quiet serenity, the kind that only comes from being freed from a long-held fear. She turned to face them as they entered, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you. You've given me my life back." Holmes nodded, his expression calm, though his eyes held a flicker of something deeper, something like understanding, like the quiet recognition that, in this case, the journey had not been just about solving a mystery, but about freeing a soul from the chains of its past. "You owe us nothing, Miss Clara," Holmes replied softly. "The strength to move forward has always been yours. We simply helped you see the way." Watson, ever the more expressive of the two, smiled warmly at her. "It is our pleasure, Miss Clara. We are simply glad to see you free." Clara stood then, her movements slower than before, as though the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders. "I'm not sure what comes next," she said quietly, as if considering her place in the world for the first time in a long while. "But I know that the shadows are gone. I can feel it, and for that I will be forever grateful." Holmes gave a small, approving nod. "The future, Miss Clara, is yours to shape. The past cannot define you any longer. You are free." The three of them stood together in the room for a moment, the soft rays of morning light pouring through the window and casting everything in a warm, golden hue. Outside, the world seemed quiet, serene. It was as if the entire manor and the land around it was beginning to breathe again, unburdened by the weight of its history. As Holmes and Watson made their way back down the stairs, the house seemed more alive than ever. The manor, which had once felt like a prison, now held the potential of something new, something full of life, of hope, of beginnings. The shadows that had clung to it for so long had finally been dispelled, not by force, but by understanding. As they passed through the hall, Mrs. Ethelstone stopped them. "Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about moving forward. Perhaps there is hope for Blackwood Manor, after all." Holmes turned to her, his eyes warm, though his expression remained steady. "Hope is something that cannot be taken from us unless we let it, Mrs. Ethelstone. Blackwood Manor is no longer a place of darkness. It is a place of renewal." Mrs. Ethelstone smiled softly, as though she too had been waiting for this moment, for the house to heal, just as Clara had. The days that followed were filled with quiet adjustments. Clara, now free from the burden of the past, began to find her footing once again. She spent time in the garden, walking the grounds, enjoying the simple pleasures she had once been denied. Mrs. Ethelstone resumed her duties, but now with a lightness in her step, and the manor itself seemed to echo with the soft sounds of life returning. Holmes and Watson, as always, prepared to leave. Their work here was done, and there were other mysteries that beckoned them. But before they departed, Holmes paused at the front door of Blackwood Manor, looking back at the house. The light was brighter now, warmer. It was as though the manor had been reborn, no longer a place of dark memories, but a home. Finally, truly, a place of peace. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, turning toward his companion, "every mystery has its end, but some endings are simply the beginning of something new." Watson nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, Holmes, I believe this is one of those times." And with that, they left Blackwood Manor behind, its future unfolding like a new chapter waiting to be written. The shadows were gone, and in their place was a quiet, enduring peace. A peace that would last long after they had gone. Chapter 10. A quiet evening. As evening descended upon Blackwood Manor, a profound sense of calm enveloped the house. The once foreboding structure, with its dark, hidden corners and haunting past, now stood bathed in the gentle light of a setting sun. The shadows that had once lurked in every room, creeping like a silent predator, had finally been dispelled, leaving only the soft warmth of evening to fill the manor. Holmes and Watson, their task complete, sat in the parlor for one final evening. The fireplace crackled softly, casting a soft glow that danced on the walls and illuminated the rich wooden panels of the room. The faint smell of burning pine mingled with the earthy scent of the manor, which, for the first time in many years, felt like home. The house had settled into a peaceful rhythm, as though it too was adjusting to the new-found tranquility. Despite the serenity of the surroundings, Holmes remained alert, his sharp mind always working, always searching for patterns, for clues. But this evening, there were no mysteries to solve, no shadows to chase. For once, there was nothing left but peace. Still, Holmes's mind wandered, lost in quiet contemplation. "Holmes," Watson began, his voice breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "I've been thinking about all that has happened here. The curse, the mystery, and Clara's freedom. It all feels almost too perfect, doesn't it? Like we've seen the resolution of a great tragedy, but there's still a weight to it." Holmes looked at Watson, his expression softening. "There are few cases, Watson, that end without leaving a trace. The mind is a tricky thing. It remembers not only the victory, but the struggle. The shadow of the past is never truly erased, but it can be quieted, can it not?" Watson nodded, understanding what Holmes meant. The resolution of the mystery had lifted a heavy burden, but for Clara, and for everyone who had lived through the manor's dark history, the scars of the past would remain. The echoes of the curse, the figure that had haunted them all, would linger, though no longer with the same power. Holmes stood, his eyes distant for a moment. He walked slowly to the window, gazing out over the grounds of Blackwood Manor. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a canvas of fading purples and oranges across the sky. The land before him, once shrouded in a dark energy, now seemed open, full of potential. "Yes, Watson," Holmes said, his voice quieter now. "There will always be traces, but they need not define us. And for Clara, for Blackwood Manor, they no longer need to haunt the present. The future is theirs to write." There was a soft knock at the door, and Mrs. Ethelstone entered, her face more at ease than it had been in days. She carried with her a tray of tea, the steam rising in delicate swirls, filling the room with its calming scent. As she set the tray down, she looked at the two men, a sense of gratitude and peace in her eyes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you once more for everything. Miss Clara, she is doing better now. She sleeps soundly without the nightmares. The manor, it feels different. It feels alive again." Holmes smiled slightly, his gaze warm, though still tempered with his usual sharpness. "It was Miss Clara's courage that freed her, Mrs. Ethelstone. We simply guided her through the shadows, but she is the one who walked toward the light." Mrs. Ethelstone nodded, her eyes misting over with emotion. "You're right, Mr. Holmes. She is stronger than I ever knew, and so is this house." As the evening stretched on, the conversation grew softer, more reflective. The mysteries had been solved, and the ghosts of Blackwood Manor had been laid to rest. There was nothing more to fear, and yet the house felt different, lighter, almost as though the very walls were breathing more easily now. Holmes, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke again, his voice gentle but carrying the weight of all that had transpired. "Watson, there is a quietness that comes with the end of every case. It's not the silence of resolution, but of acceptance. The mysteries we solve, whether they are of the mind, the heart, or the supernatural, are not just about finding answers. They are about understanding what those answers mean, and then letting them go." Watson watched Holmes, his friend, his companion, with a quiet understanding. They had seen so much together, solved so many puzzles, but this case had been different. It had not just been about solving a mystery, it had been about freeing a soul from the chains of the past, about breaking the hold of a curse that had lingered far too long. As the final embers of the fire flickered and died, the room grew colder, but not in a way that made them feel uneasy. It was the coldness of a day passing into night, of time moving forward. The sense of urgency had left them. All that remained was the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had done what needed to be done. Mrs. Ethelstone looked at Holmes and Watson, her voice soft with appreciation. "I'm not sure what will happen next, but I feel as though we have all been given a second chance. A fresh start." Holmes met her gaze, his eyes glimmering with the faintest hint of something deeper, something unspoken. Every ending, Mrs. Ethelstone, carries within it the seed of a new beginning. The next morning, as the light poured through the windows of Blackwood Manor, Clara emerged from her room, her steps light and steady. She had faced the darkness within these walls and emerged stronger for it. The figure that had once tormented her was gone, and with it, the weight of a family's cursed legacy. She was free to choose her own path. Holmes and Watson, their work complete, prepared to leave the manor. As they stood by the door, ready to depart, Mrs. Ethelstone stood beside Clara, the two of them watching as the men gathered their things. "Thank you," Clara said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've given me my life back." Holmes gave a small nod, his face softening with rare warmth. "It was your courage, Miss Clara, that freed you. We only showed you the way." As they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, Watson turned to Holmes, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It seems, Holmes, that you've once again solved the impossible." Holmes smiled in return, but there was something different in his expression, something peaceful, something that suggested a rare contentment. "Not every mystery, Watson, needs solving. Sometimes it's simply a matter of seeing the truth for what it is and letting it be." And with that, they walked away from Blackwood Manor, leaving behind a house that had been freed from its past, its shadows finally lifted. The truth had been revealed, the curse had been broken, and for the first time in many years, Blackwood Manor was truly at peace. The quiet after the storm. In the months that followed, Blackwood Manor transformed. Clara flourished, finding solace in the quiet life she had always wanted but had never been able to grasp. Mrs. Ethelstone continued to care for the house, now with a newfound sense of joy, watching as the manor slowly began to fill with the laughter and warmth it had long lacked. The memories of the past remained, but they no longer held any power over them. For Holmes and Watson, life continued as it always did. Another case, another mystery. But something about Blackwood Manor lingered with them, a reminder that not all mysteries needed to be solved. Sometimes the greatest mystery of all was simply letting go and letting peace return.